All right, hello everyone. My name is Peggy Dar, and I serve as chair of the New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners. This webinar is part of the New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners effort to provide more management information for birds of conservation concern in New Mexico's forests and woodlands. So before I turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Christine Johnson, I want to give you a brief background on Pinyon Jay and why we care about this bird. So the Pinyon jay population has declined by about 84% since the 1960s, and its remaining population, the remaining smaller population, is expected to decline by an additional 50% by 2035. So this makes it one of the fastest declining bird species in the United States. Additionally, New Mexico has more of the range-wide Pinyon jay population than any other state in the Union. So what we do in New Mexico's pinyon juniper woodlands really matters for the status of the pinyon jay population as a whole. Pinyon jays nest as a flock, generally in the same area every year. So the New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners management guidelines for pinyon juniper woodlands in New Mexico recommends finding and avoiding disturbance in traditional flock nesting locations. So this webinar is going to teach you how to find those flock nesting locations. And now I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Dr. Christine Johnson. Chris is the zoology coordinator at Natural Heritage New Mexico in the UNM biology department. She and her team have been studying pinyon jays for 18 years, the last 16 of which is focused on pinyon jay habitat use and conservation. She serves on the Pinyon Jay Multi-State Working Group and is the first author on the Birds of the World and New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners Pinyon Jay accounts. She and co-authors have published over 15 technical reports and 10 peer-reviewed papers on pinyon jays. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Christine Johnson.
Thank you, Peggy. And thanks everybody for attending this webinar and for your interest in pinyon jays. First, I want to acknowledge two of my collaborators, Nate Peterson and Jackie Smith. Nate is field tech, has been with me since 2011, and Jackie since longer than that, doing field work. And Jackie does GIS and databasing also for our pinyon jay studies. They have together found lots and lots of pinyon jay nests and are real experts on this bird. Okay, so let's start with just basic permissions for surveying for pinyon jays, and this kind of applies to anything that's not, any bird that's not listed. Before you go out to survey, make sure you have landowner permission for the lands that you're going to survey on. Even if no other permit, government permit is required. For the state, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish issues scientific permits if you're going to handle or collect birds. And only experienced researchers can receive these permissions. But if you're just surveying, you don't need a permit if you're not going to try to capture, band, or in any way impact these birds. But if you want to at some point band or put radio transmitters, collect blood, whatever, in New Mexico, you need to apply for a state scientific permit. Federal permission is required from the U.S. Bird Banding Lab also for capture, banding, radio transmitters, blood collection, or any other handling of birds. And similar to the state, a federal banding permit is not required for non-invasive surveys. But if the pinyon jay becomes listed at the state or federal level, this will change. So good to keep on top of that. And if it is listed, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service typically mandates training for surveyors. So they'll come up with a training probably based on this one if the bird is listed, and there is a chance of that because of their steep decline. And anybody that's working through a university has to file a protocol with the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, even if all you're doing is surveying. So I will start talking a little bit about the non-breeding season, even though the focus is breeding season, because some people may want to survey in the non-breeding season. Pinyon jays flock in winter. They travel over very large home ranges. And this is a photo of a pinyon jay flock that someone sent me several years ago from New Mexico. There are about 800 birds in this flock, and this is a wonderful sized pinyon jay flock. We don't see flocks this big very often anymore. I did a recent survey of eBird observations in the winter, and most pinyon jay flocks are less than 100 birds nowadays. And that's how a pinyon jay flock sounds when they're flying over. So for non-breeding surveys, we start, and this is similar to breeding season surveys, we start by using existing observations to map known pinyon jay sightings during your survey period. And a really good place for data, if you don't have any data on your jurisdiction, is to go to eBird. These are all eBird observations. They happen to be from Colorado National Monument. And each of those blue dots has information associated with it, the date, and how many birds were seen, and sometimes behavioral observations too. So if you're interested in surveying in the breeding season, you'll want to look at these dates and find out where they've been seen in the breeding season. And then we also map any existing information on vegetation. So this could be a land cover classification would be great if you can access one, or even Google imagery can give you a lot of information about the habitat that you're looking at. So you want to focus on pinyon juniper nesting and foraging habitats. And we'll talk a little bit about nesting habitats later in this talk. So here's an example of some Google Earth imagery for the same site, the Colorado National Monument. And you can see, let's see if I can, oh, I can't point this out with my mouse, but you can see that the kind of dark greenish gray areas where there's some relief there on the west side of the monument, that's pinyon juniper habitat. Whereas up in the upper right hand part of this image, that is riparian habitat. You can see the trees look different. So then we plot road routes which pass through the areas of suitable habitat and recent pinyon jay observations. These areas where jays have been seen, where you can access them by the road, and where you can, where habitat that they use is found, are the best areas to start when you're surveying for pinyon jays. So here we are again with Colorado National Monument. The outline of the border of the park or monument is in red, and the yellow are road routes. And there's a road route you can see that goes along the west side of the monument. And this is the place that we recommended they start looking for pinyon jays, because there are observations of birds there, and this particular road goes through some decent habitat. So this is what we would do first in preparation, is to plot these road routes that we will drive for the surveys. And then we drive these roads slowly, listening for pinyon jay calls. Of course, you have to have your windows down and your music off. They're loud, but from a distance, their calls can be faint. And then when you hear pinyon jays, you should try to walk to a vantage point. Try to follow them if you can. But if they're in the area, walk to a vantage point so you can watch them and see what they're doing. And I guess I should mention here, field equipment. You should have binoculars. And we'll talk also, if you have a phone with a GPS in it, that's really useful for uploading any data via an app that we've developed. So when you see a large flock just flying over, you hear them calling like that, most of the time it's going to be impossible to follow them. If they happen to go where your road is and they're, then you can follow them as far as you can. You can try to follow them on foot, but this is the difficulty with surveying for pinyon jays in the winter, is that they go around in these big flocks and they move very fast. So it can be hard to follow them, but you do what you can. And of course, you want to, if you do see them flying over, take a GPS point. There's another piece of equipment you need. And note how many birds you saw and what they were doing. Okay, so as the bottom point here, observe and record the location, the behaviors, and the flock sizes. And here are some behaviors, some calls and behaviors that you might see in the non-breeding season. There are several calls there. The main one that I want to point out is the caw. The first one that just goes basically caw. Okay, the next one is a racka call. And you hear this a lot. This is the rack or racka call is a somewhat excited call. They'll do this as an alarm call. And then the next one is a rattle call. The rattle call is one that's done only by females, and we tend to hear it more in the breeding season, but you can hear it in the non-breeding season. And it's in the breeding season, it's associated with pre-breeding behavior. In the non-breeding season, it's kind of it can be an alarm call or just an indication of agitation. Other behaviors that you might see in the non-breeding season, if there's a cone crop, a pinyon crop, you may see birds caching seeds. They'll be collecting seeds from the tops of pinyon trees and then carrying them to a caching site where they bury them in the ground. And they'll be doing this in a flock. You may also see them retrieving caches. If they've cached pinyon seeds previously, they might be walking on the ground and retrieving the caches and eating them. Usually what we see in the non-breeding season is the birds flying in a flock, but you may also see them foraging on the ground for insects or retrieving caches. In the breeding season, the beginning part of your surveys are similar. You want to target areas that you're likely to find them nesting. And in this case, it's more important to find potential nesting habitat than it is in the wintering season. And drive through doing road surveys. Pinyon jays can nest in almost any season. Primarily, they nest between April and May. But if there's been a big pinyon crop the previous fall, they might nest as early as February, even if in the snow. If food is scarce, they might not nest at all. So we look for them in April and May. And often in recent years in New Mexico, we've been finding a flock, but only a few birds in that flock are nesting, or they're not nesting at all. And we think this is a consequence of the lack of food and associated with climate change. So nesting season behaviors. This slide shows a male feeding a female, and she is quivering her wings and begging to him. This is courtship feeding, and it's something that you will see at the beginning of a breeding season. The first vocalization is a rattle call, which I played before, and we tend to hear these in flocks that are nesting or just getting ready to nest. The next one is the piping rattle. This is another one that's given by the females, and we usually only hear this in the nesting season. You can also hear begging in the background there. And then here again is begging, and there are probably some other calls here also. There's the begging. Sounds much like begging of a lot of birds, young nestlings and fledglings. So in the breeding season, we see birds break up, first of all, into smaller groups into nesting colonies. So you may have a flock of 100 birds, but you rarely find a nesting colony of 100 birds. So often they will break up and separate and then come back together as a wintering flock. And when they get ready, when a nesting group gets ready to nest, you will see pairs moving separately from the flock. And they'll be doing, performing courtship and starting to build nests. One thing that you may see that's really an interesting behavior is courtship chases. And these occur around the nesting, a traditional nesting colony site, where several birds will fly rapidly back and forth through the colony site, chasing females, presumably. The males will be chasing females. It's a dramatic display, and if you see that, it means these birds are getting ready to nest. You also see courtship feeding as in the slide. If you see birds carrying sticks in their bill, that's an indication that they're starting to build the nest. You'll see nest construction, and then after the female lays eggs and is incubating or brooding young, the males will come in and feed the females at the nest. And once a colony is well established, this is really a good way of knowing how many birds are nesting and exactly where they're nesting. If you can watch from a vantage point away from the colony site, and this will take hours probably, because the birds, the males will only come in every half hour to up to 2 or more hours. And the males will tend to come in together as a group, and they'll go to their females, and the females will come off the nest usually, beg to the males will feed them, and then the males as a group will leave the colony site and go back to forage some more for their females. This whole thing can take 1 or 2 minutes out of a 2 or 3 hour period. So you have to be vigilant, and you'll only have a short window to be able to figure out, okay, how many males came in here? Where are they going? how many females are begging, and they'll give you a really good idea of what's going on within a colony site. So it's really important to avoid disturbance and attracting predators to nesting jays. One of the reasons that they are declining so much is that they're just not having good reproductive success. And we don't want to exacerbate that situation by attracting ravens and other predators to nesting jays. So we recommend that you don't approach any closer to about 30 meters of an active nest. If you do find an active nest, it's easy to just walk right up to one and go, uh-oh, there's a female sitting there, I better get out of here. So what we recommend is that you walk at least 20 meters from the tree, record a UTM at that point, and then also make notes on the distance and the direction from the point to the tree so that you can find this nest later when they're through nesting. If you see a nest, we recommend you walk past it rather than walk to a nest and then turn around and return by the same path. This is just a way to indicate to any raven who's sitting there watching you that there's something going on in that tree. So you don't want to do that. Later return for the precise nest UTMs after fledging or nest failure. And if you do have active nests, you can determine nesting activity and the stage of nesting based on observing the parent's behavior from a distance. And you can see what's going on if it's not a super dense woodland from 50 meters or more away. And we recommend against checking nest contents unless your project requires it, because you want to avoid attracting ravens and other predators. So if a protocol, so the protocol for breeding surveys is if a flock is showing breeding behaviors, search an area for old or active nests without disturbing any nesting birds. Watch for pairs attending nests, note the location from a distance, and then if birds are not nesting at a survey site, but old nests are present, search the surrounding area for active nests. So you may find an old colony site with several old nests, but the birds are not actively nesting there. They may have just moved, and we've seen them move several hundred meters. So here's what you want to look for in nests. The view on the left is a side view of a nest in a pinyon tree. And this is not a great slide, but I include it because this is often what you see. You just see a little bunch of sticks in the fork of a tree. So it's difficult to see these from much of a distance. Sometimes you have to get right underneath them in order to see them. And then on the right is a side view of a nest in a juniper tree, and they do nest in both types. They also, around here, these are one-seed junipers, but up in the Four Corners area, they nest in Utah junipers, which the form of which is more like a pinyon tree than a juniper shrub. So here's a closer view of a stick nest. The one on the left is in a pinyon, and you see it's made with pinyon twigs for the most part. The one on the right, we found that sometimes they will use juniper bark, especially up in the area, in the Four Corners area around Farmington, where we study them. We started finding nests that had juniper bark on the outside, and these are where the area where they nest in Utah junipers. So you note the kind of cone-shaped shape of the nest. These are very deep nests. And they'll be thickly lined, as on the left here. This is primarily because pinyon jays may nest in February or March when it's quite cool. Even in April, it can be quite cool and you can have snow. So unlike a lot of the pinyon juniper woodland birds, the nest lining in a pinyon jay nest is very thick. And as you can see again on the right, they're deep nests, kind of cone-shaped, and they're usually supported by 3 to 6 supporting branches. There are other species you can confuse these nests with, and until you really have found a lot of pinyon jay nests, you should have some evidence that it's pinyon jay nest and not something else. This is a woodhouse scrub jay nest on the left, and these nests tend to be a more shallow cup with a much thinner lining because scrub jays nest later in the year and they don't typically nest in February. And we have found scrub jay nests along a horizontal branch as opposed to supported by several branches in a fork. And then northern mockingbird nests will tend to be smaller in size and much less substantial in structure, even though they may be primarily constructed of sticks. American robin nests tend to incorporate other things like fur, paper, mud, and the sticks tend to be smaller, and the shape of the nest is a little different. It's more rounded and less cone-shaped. Here's another mockingbird nest showing a less substantial structure and a very thin rootlet lining. And then the other thing that takes some experience is to be able to distinguish old versus current year pinyon jay nests. So an old nest will often be rather flattened with the sticks kind of falling out, like the one on the left, whereas a current year tends to have a more integrated shape, not losing a lot of sticks, deep and conical in shape, and just tidier. Here's another on the left, quite an old nest. This is probably 2 years old at least, maybe more. The sticks are falling out, it's flat, it kind of doesn't look like a pinyon jay nest, and the only reason we know this is that we've seen a lot of these in pinyon jay colonies, and we know what the sticks look like. Whereas a current year nest is going to be much deeper. The lining is a really good clue to the age of a nest. On the left, this is a pinyon jay nest, but the lining is really sparse and dried, so it can't be from this year. Even though the structure of the nest looks pretty good, sometimes a nest can look good for at least a year from the outside. So if you have a chance to stick your hand in or look into a nest at the lining, that'll give you some information on the age of the nest. In the current year, the lining will tend to be thick and soft. So we recommend that to establish non-nesting, you ought to make at least 3 to 4 visits, maybe about 7 to 10 days apart. Because the time that they nest can be so variable, we would say start no later than the first part of April, depending on where you are. Some places, like up in Nevada, Utah, they start earlier because the birds nest earlier than in the south, which sounds kind of the reverse of how it should be, but it really depends more on the food availability. And if there was a big cone crop in the fall, the previous fall, birds could be nesting in February or for sure in March. So as I've said several times, stay away from active nests. We don't want to spook a female off of the nest and have her leave her eggs or her nestlings unattended, and we, more importantly than that even, we don't want to attract predators. So we've developed an app for reporting survey results in New Mexico, and we're going to try to share this with other states, that heritage programs in other states that have pinyon jays. This is called EpiCollect 5 is the name of the app. And it works on any smartphone that has a GPS in it or location services. You can download it from the App Store or the EpiCollect website. And when you do, once you get it, just search for Pinyon J Survey 2020. Now, by next year, we'll probably change the name of this to 2021. But if you're looking for Pinyon J Survey, you'll find the forms for this on this app. The data that you enter will upload directly to the Natural Heritage New Mexico Biotics database for Pinyon Jays. And you might want to note this email address. Richard Norwood is our data manager, and if there are problems with reporting data or getting this app to work, you can contact him and just send him an email with the subject line Pinyon J Survey 2020, and he'll try to help you out. But it's really easy to use. So once you get this app, you'll go to projects and choose Pinyon J Survey 2020 or 2021 if it's next year. And then up in the corner where it says Add Project on this screen, you'll have, once you choose Pinyon J Survey, you can choose Add Entry, and this will give you a blank form. If you choose if you go into an existing form, you could be overriding existing data, so don't do that. Start a blank form. And then your next screen lets you enter basic survey information like your name, the date, the start and the end time, and each of these will be on a separate screen. The app will automatically fill in your location if you just hit the green box that says Update Location, but be sure you have your location services turned on in the phone. It'll give you the lat long, and it'll give you an accuracy there at the bottom. This is 10 meters in this case. Then this is a required field. You need to choose the land ownership. There'll be a drop-down menu, and if it's something other than what's available in the drop-down, there'll also be a comment or an other choice and a comment field. So please choose the ownership, whether or not your survey is positive. And negative surveys are useful. We want to know where they are not as well as where they are. So if you go out and survey an area, you don't find any Pinyon Jays, go ahead and submit the data. The next field is number of birds seen. And if you do a road survey for several miles and you see several groups at different locations, you should start a new survey form for each one because these could be different nesting groups. If you do find nests and you can assess the age and the activity, we'd like you to enter that information. If you don't know the age, you can just say, well, you can make a comment. I think there's a comment field if you could say, I don't know the age of this nest, but it looks inactive or old. We want you to indicate the age of the birds if you can, and many times if you just see a flock from a distance, it's difficult to say the age. But obviously a nestling has not left a nest. A fledgling can fly, but usually they don't fly very well. And for Pinyon Jays, adults are blue, but fledglings are completely gray. So if you see a group of birds and there are some totally gray birds in that flock, those would be fledglings. And then a juvenile is also gray, but basically later in the year and flying well. So a fledgling difference between a fledgling and a juvenile is fledglings are just out of the nest. They can't fly very well. They'll fly, if they fly at all, they'll fly short distances. And often we find fledglings when they're begging to their parents to be fed and they can't fly well and they're just sitting in a tree, oftentimes very near their nest. So you can, they're hard to see, but sometimes you can walk up to a tree and there'll be a couple of little fledglings sitting completely still and being totally quiet. But we find them because we hear them begging to their parents from a distance. So a subadult bird is a second year bird, second calendar year bird, and they will be more a dull gray blue. So they're kind of between a juvenile and an adult. And then the adult is a bright blue plumage. We'd like you to indicate the behaviors that you observe: foraging, flying, caching, perch, calling, whatever. And if there are calls, it would be great if you can make a recording of vocalizations, and you can record these and upload them through the app. One reason we want recordings is that just to be sure that you're not, your surveyors are not confusing pinyon jays with another bird species. Then we'd also like to know what habitat type you're finding these birds in. There's a drop down, and if you can't find the habitat in the drop down, you can choose other and fill in comments. But the main nesting habitats, I'll show you some photos. Persistent pinyon juniper woodland on the left here. These are woodlands with large old pinyon and juniper trees. They often have quite high canopy cover. As you can see, there are, if you look at the ground in this photo, there are patches of sunlight coming through, but there's a lot of shadow too. So these do not have a super open canopy. In contrast, the one on the right is juniper savanna, and this is a very open type with a very low canopy cover and mostly grass and juniper shrubs, and they will nest in these shrubs. The reason we have a tape in this photo is there's a nest in that tree, that shrub that she's standing in, and so that's probably about 2.5 or 3 meters tall, that tree. We have broken down savanna into 2 types: juniper savanna from the previous slide and pinyon juniper savanna on the left here. And that is still a savanna. It's mostly grass and a very open canopy, but it has both pinyon and juniper trees. And then the last one is called wooded shrubland. And this one is found more up in the Four Corners in Nevada, Utah, the Great Basin area. And this one includes pinyon and juniper trees, but there's a significant shrub component, which is primarily sagebrush, which you see in the foreground here. And if you want to read more about these different types, they came from this paper by Rami et al. 2009 in Rangeland Ecology and Management. It's called Historical and Modern Disturbance Regimes, Stand Structures and Landscape Dynamics in Pinyon Juniper Vegetation, the Western US. And this is a great paper. It talks about historical disturbance regimes and gives some basic information that will help you understand what is an appropriate management for these kinds of pinyon juniper habitats. So the next thing we want you to report is if you know if is water nearby and are the pinyon jays using it. Because we find that almost all of our colonies that we have found are within easy flying distance of water for a pinyon jay, which can be a couple of kilometers. We'd also like to know if the site that you're looking at, if it's especially a nesting area, if it has been thinned, and if it has been thinned, whether or not the pinyon jays are using the thinned area. And then you can take and upload a photo of the habitat. This is really useful for us to help classify what habitat the birds are using. And then we'd like you to try to indicate the density of the canopy cover. I would say that sparse would apply to both pinyon juniper and juniper savanna. And persistent pinyon juniper can be moderate or dense. And we ask that you just try to estimate this as best you can. And then take a photo of the birds if you can. And the reason for that, let's go back. The reason for that is, again, if whoever's surveying does not have a lot of experience, it is possible to confuse these birds with scrub jays. People do that fairly often, or maybe mountain bluebirds, although that is would be less of a problem probably. But scrub jays occur in the same habitat, and some people might get them confused. So unless you're really confident in your ability to identify pinyon jays, try to get us a photo also. Then when you get to the end here, it will ask you to save the entry, and then you can upload. The next, I don't show a photo of it, but the next screen has you uploading the data. And make sure you do the upload, because that's how we get the data to Heritage Program. Now, if you don't happen to have service or wireless at the point where you're collecting these data, it will upload later, or you can go back and make sure it uploaded later. Okay, so just kind of a final word to the wise. We always say, let the birds be your guide. Sometimes it can be very confusing being out there surveying for pinyon jays. The birds will be going one way when you thought maybe they were nesting somewhere else. And I usually, when in doubt, if I've got a dilemma like that, I usually follow the birds. So let them be your guide, let their behaviors be your guide, and their locations be your guide. And we also ask that you not copy or share this presentation without my permission. I'm happy to give the talk again, and you're welcome to play the video of the talk. But we don't want people taking slides out of it and using any of it out of context, because we think the information is important. It's important to see all the information. We don't want people to get confused about the proper way to survey. So we want to have good data is the real reason that we're asking people to just view the presentation and not copy parts of it. Okay, that's all I have.
All right, thank you, Chris. This was recorded, and we will be posting a link to the recording on the New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners website. That website is avianconservationpartners-nm.org. We also encourage everyone to sign up for the New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners listserv, where we post a bunch of relevant and new information about bird conservation in New Mexico. Directions regarding how to sign up for that listserv can also be found on the New Mexico Avian Conservation Partners website. Thank you very much for attending, everyone, and for your interest in pinyon jay conservation, and have a great day.